It's time to review one of my favorite lenses of all time, the Canon 50mm f1.2 R. This is for the new Canon EOS R mount, which means right now there's only one camera in the world you can put it on, which is the Canon EOS R camera. It's a $2,300 lens. If you want to pick it up, you can go to this link right here. Let's get into it. Okay, what do you want a 50mm prime lens for? Why not get a zoom? 50mm primes are faster. This is an f1.2 lens, so it will provide more background separation. It will also gather more light in low light conditions. 50mm is known as normal for full frame cameras like this. And when we say normal, we mean they give you the angle of view that the human eye does approximately. I don't know that that really makes sense in the way that the human eye and the brain work together to assemble a view of your entire scene. Nonetheless, 50mm is kind of in the middle. It's kind of the traditional focal length for things like street photography. 50mm primes are extremely commonly used in basketball, where you're working really close up, but also other indoor sports like volleyball. And because you're working indoors in those types of sports, you really need a fast prime lens. It gathers as much light as possible and will separate the subjects from the background as much as possible, just for the most versatility. Nowadays, I'm shooting portraits more and more wide angle. So while portrait lengths used to start around 85mm, I actually love this lens for portraits because it feels a little more intimate, and I'll show you some examples of those later. The build quality of it is great. I mean, it's plastic, but I prefer that. A lot of people want it to feel like metal, but I don't necessarily. It has two rings on it. One is focusing, and this is an electronic focusing ring, so it's not mechanically linked to the optics. That gives you some configurability, like you can configure the speed of the focusing ring as well as the direction of the focusing ring. It has a second ring, and this is a control ring. I have it configured to control the aperture, much like I do on my Fujis, and many old lenses had this. But it's really nice because now your left hand has a job. Your left hand can be adjusting the aperture while you're shooting, and it just makes things move a little bit smoother. You can set it to be just about anything, including ISO or other settings too. Let's talk about a unique aspect of this that we're going to see more of as we start to transition to mirrorless cameras, and that's the rear element. As I pull this out, you can see the rear element is right at the back of the lens, and that fits up right against the sensor of the mirrorless camera. And what that means is that this lens design is taking advantage of the reduced flange distance of this mirrorless camera. When I talked to the engineers at Canon, they said they could absolutely develop a 50mm f1.2 lens that was this high of quality for an SLR system. And there was a Canon SLR 50mm f1.2, but the quality of it was way lower. If they were to develop a lens of this quality for a DSLR, it would have been much, much bigger and heavier. So their ability to put the glass right up against the sensor almost really adds a lot of flexibility, reduces the size and the cost of the lens, and allows them to just get generally better quality. And that's part of why all these camera companies like Nikon are introducing these mirrorless systems for the long-term lens design flexibilities, and it is true. The autofocus performance of the lens has been really hit or miss, but that's a combination of both the camera body and the lens itself and Canon's current level of technology. Overall, I found I was getting about 50% of shots in focus, but it varied much by the subject. As I got really close shooting headshots with the eye detect autofocus, the eye detect on the EOS R is great, and for that I was getting about 85%. But you have to be very close for eye detect to work on the Canon EOS R, and I'll have a separate video about shooting portraits with it later. But overall, especially shooting wide open where the depth of field is so shallow, autofocus is a real challenge, but it is on any lens with such shallow depth of field. Let's look at the bokeh qualities of this lens. I have a bunch of sample pictures here that we'll look at. As you can see, like most lenses, towards the corner, it starts to look kind of footballish, and towards the center, they look very footballish, but football in a non-American way. But nonetheless, the bokeh is pretty nice and smooth. You can see I accidentally shot these at f1.4, so it wasn't completely wide open. So you see just a little hint of the aperture blades there. But when it is wide open, it is completely smooth. But what we don't see are super hard edges or any kind of weird textures in it. The bokeh quality on it is really nice. Take a quick plug. If you want to win a Canon EOS R, you can head to freesdp.com. We will give that away worldwide. And if you want to actually learn photography, something that will make a way bigger difference in your photography than buying a $2,300 lens, well, head to northrop.photo. We have the #1 photography book in the world and a bunch of training materials, and you can use the coupon PIXEL for 20% off. Let's continue on and talk about sharpness and contrast versus the Canon 50mm f1.4 that I have there. And let me just say, when I got that 50mm f1.4 and I put it on my original 5D, I was so blown away by the sharpness of that lens because it was so much better than anything I'd been working with, which was mostly zooms. But this lens completely blows away the 50mm f1.4. On the left, we have the old Canon 50mm f1.4 SLR lens, and on the right, we have the new Canon EOS R f1.2 lens. You can see the difference right away, especially as we zoom in tight. There are words that are easy to read with the f1.2 lens and very difficult to read with the f1.4 lens. But the difference is going to be most obvious when you look at the contrast. So set your eyes to the upper right and look at the histogram here. This is the histogram with the f1.4 lens, and this is the histogram with the f1.2 lens. As I flip back and forth between these, the f1.2 histogram gets spread out. The f1.4 histogram is bunched up in the middle. The f1.2 histogram is spread out. This indicates the lens has significantly better contrast when you're shooting side by side. And as a result, as we look at this f1.4 lens, it is washed out. The f1.2 lens is crisp and clear. And let me be clear about this. The f1.4 lens is a fantastic lens. That's how good the f1.2 lens is. It has a clarity that we just really have never seen before. It is pretty remarkable. Let's go on and talk about the f1.2 lens at f1.2 and f2. Looking at the same lens at different apertures, you can see the 50mm is very sharp wide open at f1.2, but it's a little bit sharper at f2, especially in the corners. The sweet spot of the lens seems to be around f2. If you have a Canon EOS R, there are only 3 lenses native for it. So let's compare it against the zoom, the 28-70 f2 at f2. The f1.2 prime is significantly sharper, as you'd expect from a super expensive, massive prime. The difference is more noticeable in the corners. Now let's take a look at the image quality of the EOS R with the 50 f1.2 versus the Fuji X-T3 and the 56mm f1.2, which is equivalent to about an 85mm f1.8 if it were a full frame body. First, the focal length difference here is pretty obvious. The Canon is wider angle, and like I said, I kind of like this. It feels a little more personal and intimate and modern. The 85 is very traditional. You can see the 85 definitely blurs the background a little more because the background is just more compressed. Zooming into the in-focus eye, you can see the Canon EOS R 30 megapixels with this expensive prime lens. They do outperform the Fuji and the 56mm. The Fuji does great, but the Canon, of course, is quite a bit sharper. Now I'm just going to go through a set of pictures that I've taken with the lens to discuss the impressions and qualities of the lens in different conditions. Some of these were taken at the press event that Canon sent us to in Hawaii. So some of these are professional models. The conditions in these events are really difficult because I can't say move the model to a different condition or add in diffusers or anything. I'm always kind of fighting. So the lighting and posing here are not great, but nonetheless, this is kind of what I have. And you can see even zoomed way in, the qualities of it are really nice. And even shooting wide open, it's just fine. And this is an unedited RAW file. So you might expect a lot of vignetting, but there's really not much there at all. There is a little bit of vignetting, especially shooting wide open, and it mostly just appears if you shut down a stop or two. But the whole point of getting an f1.2 lens is that you're going to want to shoot it wide open sometimes. It's a distinctive thing. There aren't many 50mm f1.2s out there. So when you shoot with it, your pictures are going to have a unique quality that people don't know about, but that they can feel. It just sets you apart from every other 50mm f1.4 out there. And you can see it in this shot just shooting wide open. Like, it just blurs the background a little bit more than basically any lens in the world could do. And it does it while retaining just crazy amount of sharpness on the focal plane. Over and over again, it did a pretty good job. Actually, it looks like maybe it caught our nose here. And that's one of the things right now. This is a $2,300 lens, but the only body available is not really a pro grade body. It's a consumer body, single card slot, iffy focusing system. And that means we're kind of waiting for the right body to come along to use this lens on. But right now, if you want the lens, you got to use that body. Another weakness with the body is that there's no sensor stabilization. The lens itself does not have image stabilization. And all these pictures were taken at 1/60th or 1/90th of a second. But you can see there's camera shake in every single shot. But wait, that's above the reciprocal rule. Don't you get shots without camera shake if you exceed the reciprocal rule? And it's really not true, especially when you start to get into higher megapixel cameras and super sharp lenses. You really have to get the shutter speed way up there. And that's why, please, Canon, please give me a body with sensor stabilization to use this kind of awesome glass on, because there's no point at which camera shake disappears. If you double the shutter speed, the amount of camera shake is reduced by half. But as you continue to double it, you will reduce the camera shake by half and half and half again. But there's always still that little bit of lack of sharpness that's introduced, and it really needs to be in the body, because I know to put stabilization in the lens, you would have had to have made some real serious compromises. And we had this whole set really kind of ruined because of the lack of sensor stabilization. Once we turned the strobes on in this particular set, we were able to get sharp shots with it, and you can see the lens is like viciously sharp. Like, it does not hide any amount of detail. You don't necessarily need this much detail, but when you want it, it's crazy amounts there. You can see in this particular case, the camera focused on the far lens. Again, not ideal. That body, it's a struggle to get the focusing point exactly where you want it with this particular fast lens. But when you do land it, the results are pretty crazy. This is zoomed in 2:1. For astrophotography, 50mm is a little tight for most people, but I did want to show that it does show some coma up in the corners. You can see as we get right into the corners, there's this kind of effect. It's not too bad. Here's a picture of Chris Gampet, the photographer that Chelsea took, and I just wanted to show it off because I think this highlights a lot of the lens's best qualities. The scene here is very backlit, very contrasty, and the lens does not wash it out at all. It really captures all of that contrast. Because it was shot wide open, the background separation is greater than you could basically get with any other lens at this focal length, and that gives it this unique look. And it's hard to describe what's cool about this photo, but part of the credit definitely goes to the unique properties of the lens. Here's some pictures of my kid getting ready for homecoming, and if we reset this to look at the original photo, you can see it was a heavily backlit situation, but I was able to pull those shadows up, and the lens, even shooting in heavily backlit conditions, was able to still produce a very, very contrasty picture. Many other lenses, including the 50mm f1.4, would have gotten washed out. So if you do want to buy it, here's a link that you can use to pre-order it, or if you just want to win the Canon EOS R, you can head to freesdp.com. If you want to learn photography, please go to northrop.photo and use the coupon code PIXEL for 20% off the #1 photography book in the world, or our Art and Science of Photography video training series. If you have follow-up questions about the 50mm, you can write it down below. And please give me a like and subscribe. Bye.